what we're going to see is Jewish history is a waxing and waning, right? We're in our land, we establish our presence, then we have a kingdom, then foreign invaders come, temples destroyed, we're exiled, then we manage to come back, another 400 years, temples destroyed again, we leave again, and so Jewish history is really a kind of seesaw, going back and forth in these extremes. Now, the rabbis, our Torah tells us that the flourishing of the Jewish people is really dependent upon our relationship to God. And so there's a Jewish approach to history, which is more than just looking at the facts, more than just looking at the political, socio-economic causality. It's looking at, in a sense, divine messages within the history. So we're going to be looking at that as well. And the rabbis very clearly viewed our exile from the land, because the Torah says that we have to merit to be in the land. So if we were kicked out of it, then because the Jewish people strayed. And we're going to see that that is kind of the roller coaster, if you will, of Jewish history. I brought this to help envision a timeline. And what we're going to look at is Jewish history, in a sense, we can divide up into 1,000-year periods. The first 1,000-year period, which we talked about last time, started with Abraham around 1900 BCE. The patriarchs, the Jews going to Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, 40 years in the Sinai, and then coming into the land of Israel. And the first period in the land of Israel, which is a period of the tribes, where there was no central capital really, Jerusalem did not yet exist. It was a looser affiliation of tribes, and so that is the first 1,000 years of history. So 500 years to the birth of the nation, the patriarchs, the Jews in Egypt. Then you have the desert, living in the land of Israel, until the beginning of what we call the First Temple. And that's where we pick up today, with the story of the beginning of kingship, which started with King David and King Saul. King David being the more famous one, because Saul, after a number of years, was dethroned, deposed by the prophet. And this period is known as the period of the First Temple. King David, who was a shepherd boy, the youngest of 10 brothers, was picked out by the prophet, obviously not for his physical prowess. He was kind of the runt of the litter, although we're all familiar with the famous story of David and Goliath, where he took on the Philistine giant. How tall was he? You know, Chinese basketball players who are 8 feet tall, right? Could have been like that. And King David, back then, people were generally smaller, so maybe he was 5 feet tall. Okay, so you imagine the scene, right? So King David went on to become the great king of Israel. He's also viewed as the first king and as the ancestor of the person who will be the last king, the Mashiach, the Messiah. So he, in a sense, set the standard for Jewish kingship. He was also a great religious personality. He wrote the book of Psalms, which forms a lot of our prayer book. He was a poet. He was a warrior. He was really the, as they call it, in Greece it was the philosopher king. But for us it was the religiously inspired and inspiring figure and king. And he conquered Jerusalem, set up Jerusalem as the capital, but didn't merit to build the temple because it said he had too much blood on his hands. He had fought too many wars, even if they were justified. And so who built the first temple? His son, Solomon. And the building of the first temple, what was the temple for? So the ark had traveled with the Jewish people throughout the desert when it was built. It had come into the land of Israel, where it was stationed temporarily, and the ark had around it what they called the tabernacle, which was really a transportable temple, a rector synagogue. Once King David conquered Jerusalem, King Solomon built the first temple, then you have a permanent structure, which was a building of stone and gold, and ornate, and it became the center of worship for the Jewish people. And that period of the first temple lasted some 500 years, 450 years. And this is also in the books of the Old Testament. The second half of the prophets, really, is the story of the 500 years. And unfortunately, if you look at the history of the timeline of Jewish history, our golden period, really, right after King Solomon things started to already turn bad. His son and one of the generals had a civil war, and there was a falling out, and the nation split into two between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And during the next 400 or so years, some of the kings would be more righteous, some of them would be mediocre, and some of them would be bad and lead the people away from God. And this kind of decline, with some ups, during the period of the prophet Isaiah, who was famous for his vision of a universal peace for all mankind, and no nation shall make war upon another, and they'll beat their swords into plowshares, right? The famous Isaiah wall opposite the UN. There was another period of King Josiah, who people have not heard of much, but there were periods of religious renewal, but then slow decline again. And so, halfway through that period, Israel was invaded. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, took away the Jews and exiled them to 10 tribes, the northern kingdom, and took them into exile. And those are known as the 10 lost tribes. And we don't know exactly where they are. There's all sorts of accounts of throughout the Far East. In northern Burma, there's a group that identifies themselves as the tribe of Menashe. And some of them have converted, moved to Israel, and rejoined the Jewish people. So you have little inklings of peoples throughout the Far East, but do we really know? We don't exactly know. It's very possible that they are the remnants of these tribes. So that was around the year 722. Then things start to go bad again, and finally, the final kind of straw was in the year 560, when the Babylonians invaded and brought the Jewish people into captivity. And that's known as the Babylonian exile. Now, fortunately, before they left, the prophet Jeremiah said that the exile would last 70 years. It would only last 70 years, which is about 2 generations. And then the people would be brought back to the land. How exactly, we didn't know. But very dramatically, before he left, he bought land, took the deed, buried it in the ground, and said, I'll be back to, or my descendants will be back to reclaim their property. So he kept an optimistic view, but the temple was destroyed, the center of worship. The ark was hidden, and despite the raiders of the lost ark seeking it in Egypt or somewhere, right? We believe it's under the Temple Mount, and it was hidden there and never found again. So the Jewish people are exiled for 70 years. During that period is the story of Purim, a holiday we just had, when an evil Persian viceroy made a plot to kill the Jewish people, and Esther, who was a Jewish girl, taken into the king's harem and then made queen, foiled the plot. So that period is known as the period of the Babylonian exile. And then one of the Persian kings, known as King Cyrus, gave the Jewish people permission to return to the land. Some people speculate that he might have been Queen Esther's son, because she was queen, so her children would have been Jewish. So he looked favorably upon the Jewish people. And what's so interesting is that he gives them permission to return to the land. And now, how many Jews were there in exile? 500,000, 1 million, who knows, living in Persia, Iraq, and Iran. And the king gives them permission to return. How many return? The prophet Ezra Nehemiah, the two prophets, lead a group of people, they say somewhere approximately 20,000 Jews return. Right? The famous psalm, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down, we dreamed of Zion. And they're dreaming of Zion, but when the opportunity actually occurs, how many go back? Not so many. And here you see history repeating itself, right? The beginning of the Zionist movement, early 20th century, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, which we'll talk about in a later series, how many Jews went? 10 to 20,000, about the same. And it wasn't until the pogroms got worse in Europe, and then the Holocaust, that Jews returned in large numbers. So here, fortunately, it didn't take that. Eventually, the Jews started to return in bigger numbers. The first group went. It was difficult to rebuild, but they rebuilt the second temple, and that was known as the Second Temple. And that period will last about another 450 years as well. And it's during this period that we have the rise of Greece. Alexander the Great conquers the whole known civilized world at the time, including the Middle East, including Jerusalem. And around the year 300, he comes into Israel. And this is a different type of exile, because both times before we were slaves in Egypt. We were in exile in Babylon. We were out of our land and under oppression. But this time, it's very different, because we were in our land, but conquered by a foreign power and lost our national independence. And the way it's so different is that it wasn't, it's interesting, because the rabbi's attitude towards this is that, yes, we would ideally like to have political independence to rule our own country, but the rabbis never really believed in freedom or death. Right? Famous call of, who was it? War of Independence, freedom or death. One of the figures of the American independence. And when the taxation got too onerous, and when they were sick of the British, right, they fought and kicked them out. So the Jewish approach was always, at least the rabbi's approach was, as long as we can live as Jews, it's not great to be invaded and conquered by someone, but it's not necessarily a reason to put one's whole existence in jeopardy. And so they tolerated it. And this period of toleration lasted for some 100 years, but then things started to get worse. And this is the prelude to what is known as the period of the Maccabean revolt. And whether it's that now it wasn't really the Greeks anymore. After Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire was divided into three. Greece itself, the Seleucid Empire, which was the Syrian Greeks, and the Ptolemaic Empire, which was the Egyptian Greeks. So there were three empires, and Israel was between Syria and Egypt. And it would get bounced back and forth between those two empires. And but around the year 200, the Syrians retook it. And whether it was that they had a more aggressive Hellenization program, or whether it was there were more Jews who had started to assimilate and they pushed the program, what happened was that there was more conflict, because there were those who wanted to modernize, become Hellenists, and there were those who wanted to remain traditional. And this, we're going to see that often our worst enemies, our own downfall, comes not from without, but from within. And often that's the problem. Now, what was it about Hellenization? So, as we learned when the United States went into Iraq, right? You can invade a country, but it doesn't mean you are ruling the country, right? It's one thing to invade it, to take military control of it. It's another thing to really be able to kind of rule over it and have the people agree to your ruling it. And there were different strategies in the ancient Near East on how to do that. So the the Babylonians had one strategy. Their strategy was, you take people, you uproot them from their national homeland, you move them to another place, and they'll lose their national identity. They'll become a melting pot, right? That's in the United States, you see that. You know, people move from other countries, they come here, once they're no longer in their native country, yeah, maybe a few generations, you remain Italian American, Irish American, Jewish, but after a few generations, what happens? You melt in, start to acculturate. So fortunately in Babylon, the Jews didn't stay that long and went back. But the Hellenists, the Greeks, had a different strategy. Their strategy was, don't move the peoples around, to make them all the same. Export your Greek culture and make them part of Greece. And that's how you'll build your empire, right? I just saw a book in the library, Islam versus McWorld, right? They view that we are exporting our McWorld, right? McDonald's, right? Our world of consumerism and media, and that by doing that we were acculturating the world in a sense, you know, creating a Western dominion over the world, and they want to fight back. So the Greeks had a similar, they would export, they did it more, I don't think that, you know, we do it as a self-conscious strategy to take over the world or even to make the world whole part of our economy, right? But in effect, that's what happens. But the Greeks had a conscious strategy to export Greek culture. And the problem with Greek culture is...
Are they doing that to make money?
No, to consolidate power, right? What are the three things people go after? Money, power, and honor. A lot of times all three are linked, right? When people, you know, after your first, I don't know, $50 million, you know, how many mansions and planes and boats can you buy, right? So why do people become billionaires? It's about power and honor, right? And a lot of times, power will lead to money, but it's not necessarily the primary driving force. Sometimes it is. You know, the Roman Empire, it became that. They would conquer and then acculturate and then proceed to kind of, what's the word, squeeze out everything they could from the countries that they conquered. You know, the colonists in the 19th century, European colonies also were accused of that, right? They viewed it as, in theory they said, it's a white man's burden for us to go bring Western culture to the world. But in practice, what were they doing? What the conquistadors had done, taking the gold, taking the minerals, taking the manpower, slaves, right? I mean, this went on with the Western world for some 500 years. Yeah.
Have you seen the movie The Life of Brian? Monty Python film?
Yeah, a while ago.
Because they're like listing all the reasons why they hate the Romans, and they start getting to reasons like, and they built those damn roads and the sewer system and the baths and, you know, like law and order. I mean, they actually, in some cases, believe they were bringing good things.
So it's very interesting because in the Talmud there is such a debate.
Okay.
Where one of the rabbis says, the Romans, you know, look, they brought us roads, and they brought us city planning, and they brought us bridges. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the rabbi of the Zohar, in fact, said, they only built the roads so they can tax us. And they only built the bridges so they can conquer us. And they only built the villages and the squares so the harlots could have some place to hang out and people could come and do their stuff. So, you know, human motivations, national motivations are very mixed, right? Very mixed, right? America goes into a country because of it, you know, the injustice being perpetrated, but we're very selective about, you know, where we choose to or not to. So, in any case, but Greek culture was very different from Jewish culture. The emphasis upon the aesthetic also led to an emphasis upon the physical and upon the superficial. It was a hedonistic society which put physical pleasure primary. Remember, this was not the golden age of Greece with Aristotle and Plato. This was 200-300 years later. And it wasn't even Greece, it was a secondary colony of Greece, Syria. And this is the colony of the colony, Judea, which was the colony of Syria. So you're talking about, this isn't the culture of Beethoven and Goethe, this is the culture of, MTV and trash talk, or the equivalent to Greek culture. So there was a culture war, so to speak. And many of the Jews who started to assimilate more got with the program, said, you should change your names, dress like Greeks, we have to go attend the games, right? And in the book of Maccabees, which is not part of the Bible, it is a book that was written after the Bible, it's not in the Jewish Bible. They tell about the temple, the gymnasium, which was built at the base of the Temple Mount. And the young Kohanim, instead of doing the service in the temple, they'd run down the mountain and compete in the games. And, it wasn't also, but the problem was it wasn't just as innocent as, when we used to skip Sunday morning Hebrew school and go play football in the park. These games, these athletic competitions, were the worshiping of the body, competing in the nude. And there was also it was part of the whole decadent culture, and the putting the physical as the primary value. And so, and then it started to become corrupted as well. And what set off the Greek really heavy-handed imposing of Greek culture and cracking down on making Jewish life illegal and outlawing it was that the head religious position in Jerusalem, the high priest, was bought out by someone. And the people rioted in the streets. The Syrians, of course, didn't want unrest. They suppressed the riot. Jews were killed. More riots, more suppression, and eventually you have Antiochus IV, who was named Antiochus Epiphanes, who said, I'm sick of these Jews. And generally, we're going to see with the Greeks and the Romans, when they were sick of us, what did they do? They knew, hit them in their Achilles heel. Hit them where it hurts. Where was that? With our Jewish lives. So Antiochus said, we're going to put a statue of me in the temple. Jews aren't allowed to keep the Shabbat. We're going to go and force them to become Greeks. And so the traditionalists, the ones who cared about Jewish life, fled the capital, ran into the mountains. What did the Greeks do? Chased them into the mountains. And they hid in caves, they chased them into the caves. And some people say the dreidel spin is what? Well, when it was illegal to study Hebrew, they would play with the top, and on different sides were the Hebrew letters. And so that's the way they would teach Hebrew, clandestinely through a game. And the Greeks would pursue them into the mountains. They would gather the people from the villages together and force the village elder to either eat kosher, non-kosher pork in front of everyone, or force them to bow down to a statue, and in this oppressive way, tried to uproot Judaism. And there was one family, father and 5 sons, who had been the high priest, who fled. When the Greeks came to the square to force them to do this, what did they do? Instead of being killed, and there were Jews who gave up their lives, said, no, I refuse, and they were killed, to set an example for the other Jews to hold strong to their Jewish lives, they took out their swords, killed the Greek battalion, and fled further into the mountains. Called many other Jews to come to them, and started to build a guerrilla force to fight back. And the Greeks came after them, they won some skirmishes, more Jews gathered, till eventually they had 1,000, 2,000, they started training, and it turned out, and remember, these were not the Jewish farmers, these were, the Kohanim from the capital. They weren't trained as fighters. They weren't even physically strong, but they set themselves to do what they had to do. And so it turned out that one of the sons of this family, Judah, turned out to be a brilliant tactician and strategist. And eventually they built up an army of 10,000 strong. The Syrian forces were 40,000, 50,000, 60,000, and they would regularly start to have victories. Of course, using unconventional guerrilla tactics. But as we know, guerrilla warfare can be very effective, as we learned from Yankees against the Brits, the Viet Cong against the Americans, right? You can take on an empire. And eventually, they retook the temple in Jerusalem. They started winning these battles, pushing the Greeks back, pushing them back. And it's also, when you're fighting for your own homeland, of course, you are motivated, you're fighting in a different way. And so they retook part of the land, more of the land, Jerusalem, and particularly the temple. And as I said before, we weren't exiled from our land, but we were exiled from our religious life and from our national self-rule. So they retook the temple, and this is where the famous Hanukkah story comes in. There is a series of laws around the temple called laws of purity, where objects or people who came into contact with dead bodies could not be brought into the temple. So when they retook the temple, everything had to be repurified, which was done through a process of immersion in water, in a mikvah. And so they started to repurify everything. And one of the services which was done every day in the temple was the lighting of the menorah. How many branches did the menorah in the temple have? Trick question here. How many menorah does our Hanukkah menorah have? 8. It has 8 branches, and then the shamash,
Yeah.
9th, right?
9.
How many branches did the one in the
7.
temple have?
7.
7 branches, right. So they wanted to relight the menorah. They didn't have enough oil. They found all of the oil had been rendered impure, had been tainted, and they found one jug of oil that had the seal of the high priest on it, which meant it was the original pure oil which had been used. And a sealed jug cannot be tainted. So they had one jug of oil. It would take them a week to get new oil. What happened? Famous story. It lasted for the rest of the week. Now what's so interesting about this story is that the lighting of the menorah in the temple was not the main part of the service in the temple. What was the main part of restoring service in the temple? It was the animal offerings. Yet, here was this miracle done for this part of the temple, which wasn't the main part. So, what was the meaning behind it? Why did this happen? What was the message, so to speak? As I said before, you can look at history from military point of view, sociological point of view, but we also look at it from a God point of view. And from a God point of view, really the miracle of the Hanukkah story was what? It was a military victory. It was that we retook, this ragtag group of Jewish rebels were able to push off the Syrian Greek Empire. That was the real miracle. But the message was that by the miracle of the oil, what does the menorah represent? What did the light of the menorah represent?
The oil that lasted while...
Right, but the light itself, right?
Glow.
The spiritual glow.
Oh.
So what they were being told is, yes, you had a military victory, but that's not what you should be celebrating. Because in Judaism, we don't glorify war, we don't glorify battles. And it's a necessary thing to do, but it's not what's important for us. It's not what we want to glorify. What was important for us is, once again, the rebellion only started once the Greeks started to religiously oppress us. We were politically oppressed for 100 years. We just lived with it. But it was really about the spiritual, fighting for our spiritual freedom. That's when it became intolerable, and And that's when the rebellion started, and that's why the miracles occurred. And that's how they were able to retake Jerusalem. So the miracle of the oil, which was really a minor aspect of the whole story, was God's message to say, this is what was really important, and you're fighting for the right things. You're fighting for the Spirit. So Hanukkah could have wound up being Jewish, in Russia they used to have May Day, where they parade the whole army down the center of the city. So Hanukkah could have wound up being our Jewish military celebration day. But it's not. It's a day of celebrating the Spirit. So that's really the message. What's also so interesting is Purim, the holiday is celebrated when the battle was won, when the Jews were saved. Hanukkah, we celebrate the reestablishing of the Second Temple. We don't call it a Third Temple, we call it the rededication. The word Hanukkah means rededication. We rededicated the Second Temple. We celebrate Hanukkah on that day, not the day when the battle was won. How long did it take for the final battles to be won? Another 10 years. And in the process, 4 out of the 5 brothers would die, very tragically. And so we don't even celebrate around the victory, right? That would only occur years later. And eventually Simon, the 5th brother, Jonathan, my namesake, was killed under an elephant. The Greeks used elephants as war machines. It was the ancient tanks of the day, right? Same in the famous story of Hannibal crossing the Alps in an elephant, right? The only way apparently to take down an elephant is its underbelly. So they went under the elephant, killed it, and the elephant fell on it and crushed it. So they fought valiantly. And then Simon became ultimately won the final battles, and he was the kind of head of the Jews. Now, the rest of the story of the Maccabees, which we often don't tell, isn't as glorious as the Hanukkah story. Because, first of all, what happened was, the Maccabees, as we said before, were priests. And in the Torah, we're told that the priests are not supposed to be kings. The kings are supposed to be from the tribe of Judah. The priests are from the tribe of the Levites. So really there is a balance of powers, a distribution of power in the Jewish people. And Simon became king. And as so often is the case in revolutions, the revolutionaries, when they become the establishment, it doesn't go so well. So for the next 150 years was what is called the Hasmonean dynasty. That was the name of the family of the Maccabees. And by the way, the name Maccabee, we're not sure what it means. It could come from Mi Kamocha Hashem, which is who is like you, O God. It might mean hammer. A few years ago there was a Jewish superhero created called the Hebrew Hammer. You see those comic books? So they might have been the Hebrew Hammers, but the family name was the Hasmoneans. And they ruled for 150 years. And what happened tragically was that as I said, when the revolutionaries become the establishment, like after the French Revolution, Robespierre, right? What did they do? They cut off a lot of heads, a lot of blood spilled. And threw people into Bastille, the same prison where they had been thrown by the king. Russian Revolution, what happened? The Reds overthrow the Whites, communists get in power, and then, there's a series of purges, right? They kill half their leaders because they're paranoid, and then, we know Stalin's bloody regimes. So, unfortunately, one of the descendants of the Hasmoneans, Yanai, ruled for many, many years. Some people say 70, 80 years. And his record was very mixed. There are periods where he killed off some of the rabbis, he went against the Torah, and you see the beginning of what we already saw a little bit in the Greek period, which is the Jewish people breaking off into different sects, if you will, sects, or denominations, if you want to call it that, to look at it more from a modern point of view. And so you kind of have different denominations of how to live Judaism. Most notably in this period, you have two groups called the Pharisees. You might have heard of, anyone heard of that term, right? It became a very negative term. We'll explain why when we start talking about the New Testament. And the other group were the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not follow the oral law. They didn't believe in the afterlife. In other words, it was kind of a different version of Jewish religion. And this is the beginning of kind of the history of different break-off denominations of how to live Judaism. And he allied himself with the Sadducees, oppressed the Pharisees, then went back to the Pharisees, back and forth. And a lot of these Jewish kings who would rule in this period started to rule in the way of the Roman rulers, which, if you know anything about it, paranoia, megalomania, killing off family members, corruption, not good stuff. So this period there was Jewish self-rule, which is a good thing. But as I said before, so often we bring problems upon ourselves. What happened was there was actually a queen. The only queen in Jewish history was one from the Hasmonean dynasty called Shlomo Tzion, or I guess Salome of Zion. I think the English translation name it is not Solomon, it's Salome. So it's kind of like a feminine, female version of the name. And she had two sons, Aristus and Aristobulus. And as happened with King Solomon, the two sons don't get along, or they did it first. One of the generals turns one of the sons against his brother. They start fighting. The nation starts to divide. And here is the beginning of the next calamitous period of Jewish history, because one of the brothers figures, oh, the way I'll beat my brother is I'll ally myself with foreign power. And what was the up-and-coming foreign power at the time? The Roman Empire, right. So he goes to the Romans and says, hey, I'll make a deal, you back me, and when I get in, we'll have good relations. I'll bring you guys in a little bit. And he did. He brought in the Romans, and the next 50 years will be a process of the Romans slowly getting their claws more and more into the land of Israel, until the final king to be appointed by the Romans was one of the most famous kings of the period, King Herod. Who's heard of King Herod? Anyone? King Herod? So he was the one who was known to have rebuilt the temple, made it very beautiful. If you go to Israel today, most of the major ancient sites you're going to see are King Herod. The Western Wall tunnels, anyone in on that? King Herod, right? So, in fact, they even call them Herodian stones, right? The stones with the top of it is cut in a little bit, it's like framed. And King Herod, his Jewish origins were even very suspect. He was born, some people believe, from a slave who was semi-converted to Judaism. His father was from a tribe who converted 100 years before but weren't really accepted. And so some people believe that he tried to prove his Jewish credo, tried to create his Jewish cred by undertaking all these master building projects. He was also, as I said, incredibly paranoid. And if you've been to Masada, Masada is famous for where the Jews, rebels against Rome, held out. But who built Masada? It wasn't them, it was Herod. He built it as his escape castle. That was one. And there's another famous structure called the Herodium. If you take the bus south of Jerusalem to Efrat, to Hebron, you'll see on the left a mountain. It's a very curious mountain because it goes up like this and then the top is flat. Cut off. And it's not because it was a volcano. He took a mountain cut it off, emptied it out, and created a palace within there. Also, to be well protected. And there was a very strange postscript to this story, is that for years they were searching for Herod's tomb. Where was he buried? Because he liked to do everything big, and you'd imagine that he'd make a big thing out of where he was buried. So at the base of the Herodium, they found this walkway and these pillars and pools of water, or where had been pools of water, leading to this one spot. And they always assumed that's where Herod's tomb was. There's one. He said, no, it's not there. It's not it. And it appears at the end, there was a exhibit in the Israeli Museum about this 2 years ago. We were there. So, at the end of his life, he changed his mind. And apparently, he stuck his tomb back halfway up on the mountain. And this guy finally discovered it, gave some copies. And the next day, he got enormous press. He's sitting on a wooden beam. They're talking, and he slips. By then, an older man, 30 years he'd been with us. Slips, falls over backwards, and hits his head, and dies a couple of days later. It's like,
While he's interviewing about this?
not on TV, but he was talking with people. Yeah.
It's like the mummy's curse.
We don't believe in those. We don't believe those things, but it's very.
So they found Herod's remains.
I'm not sure they actually found the remains or just some of the sarcophagus. I don't remember exactly. So what's happening during this time in terms of the Jewish people? So as we said before, the Sadducees, who didn't follow the oral law, had taken over Jerusalem. But sometime during the period of the Maccabees, of the Hasmonean kings, the rabbis had gotten back in power. And some people believe that there's another group called the Essenes, fled Jerusalem, ran to the desert, created, and then, as the people wrote, scribes sitting there transcribing, and they wrote a series of books, transcribed a series of scrolls, which eventually were discovered and came to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. We get to talk about the beginnings of Christianity. I'll talk about why the Dead Sea Scrolls maybe were so significant, why they got so much press. The real reason why they're significant is because this is the oldest copy of the Torah that we have. In other words, until 50 years ago, the oldest Torah we had was a Torah from the year 1000, the Leningrad Codex, or the Aleppo Codex from the year 900, which basically, we had a Torah from 1,000 years ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls are from this period, about 100 BCE, putting back the earliest scrolls to another 1,000 years. So you see from a Jewish point of view why they're so significant, because, they give more. So, yeah, I mean, the Torah is almost exactly the same. Very, but by and large, they're very, very close. Jerusalem, the Israel Museum, the Dome of the Rock, which is there's the Shrine of the Scroll, which is a round building. And in fact, it's made to look like one of the jars that the scrolls were found in. It's a white building with a roof like that, and they have the entire Isaiah scroll unrolled on the outside on the wall. So it's a round building, and the entire scroll is like this, and it's a big building. It's 60 chapters of Isaiah. So, you can see 2,000-year-old scrolls of Jewish holy writings. So during this period also was the beginning, or not the beginning, but the development of what is known as the oral Torah, the oral law, and particularly the, I guess, core of the Talmud, which is called the Mishnah. And it's a period of rabbinic debates, of rabbinic academies, of Jewish scholarship developing more and more. The great rabbis, such as Hillel, right? Don't do unto others that which we wouldn't have to do unto you. And now, at the same time, as I said, there were the Pharisees, the rabbis, the Sadducees, there were all sorts of today we have Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, New Age, within Orthodoxy, Hasidic, non-Hasidic, modern Orthodox, right? Jews, we love, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So you also had other breakaway people who were just and because during the Roman period, Herod's rule was not great. I mean, the tension with the Roman Empire was getting worse and worse. And then what happened was, the Romans, once Herod was gone, the Romans no longer wanted to appoint a Jewish king, even though Herod was really just, we'd call it vassal king. In other words, they let the local country have a king who is supposedly Jewish, but he does the bidding of the Romans, right? The Romans had virtually all but taken over. After we'd fought for our independence under the Maccabees, we brought the Romans in, and they gradually took over. And then you had a series of corrupt governors who were put in by the Romans. And this is what we're saying before. Are they there? No, beautiful empire, or are they there to milk it dry? And you had these taxes to be sent back to Rome, but their cut became, instead of being 10%, 20%, would become 50%, the graft, the corruption. And basically Rome was, as long as the people are quiet and you can send back the taxes, they did whatever they did. And it started to get worse and worse, and the people started there was turmoil, unsettlement, people would start to get upset at the Romans, to talk against the Romans would suppress them. And in the middle of all of this, you have these charismatic leaders who say, things are so bad, the Messiah has to come, there's no other way, we can't throw off the Romans, we're oppressed, Jewish life is being squelched. And what would the Romans do? Now, the idea of a Messiah is the reinstating of the Jewish king. Remember we said, the tradition is the Messiah will be a descendant of King David. So basically, when you say that you want to reinstate, you want the Jewish Messiah to come, what are you saying? We want a Jewish king. Now, if you're in the empire business, you're not too happy with that, right? So there was an itinerant preacher, meaning a guy who would travel from place to place, who would start teaching, people would come to him, and his name was Yeshu, or Jesus. Now Yeshu actually means, say, but the name Joshua, Yahushua also, an uncommon name in Judaism. And when we talk about Jewish Jesus, the thing to realize is that Jesus was an observant Jew. Okay? Modern Christianity turned him into the Son of God, a Messiah, a religion which wasn't, for 1,500 years, totally disassociated itself from Judaism, right? The Jews were killing them. We'll get into that. Let me give you some of the discussion about Jesus. In the New Testament, it says, he talks about how Jesus would go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. Right? It says and he was known to be someone who tended to the poor and the sick people. So what was it? What were they grabbing onto? His tzitzit, right? He wore the tzitzit on the corners of his garment. In Galatians, Corinthians, and Romans, it talks about how they kept kosher. And it's famous teaching in Mark, where Jesus is quoted to have said, by the way, we don't have any of Jesus' teachings, we only have the teachings of his disciples who wrote down his teachings. And he said, I've come not to abolish the commandments, but to fulfill them. So he was an observant Jew who promoted Jewish observance. Now we also see theologically how close his teachings were to the rabbi's teachings, right? What I quoted Hillel before, that which is harmful to you, do not do unto others, right? What did Jesus say? He said, all things that men should do to you, do you to them. So Hillel said in the negative, don't do something you don't want done to you. Jesus said, do to others what you would want other people to do to you. Okay, same teaching. He said, the Sabbath is made for man, and it's not that man is made for the Sabbath. The Talmud, the rabbis, quoted as saying, the Sabbath was handed over to you, and you were not handed over to the Sabbath. Okay?
Is that another way of saying that the Sabbath is a privilege?
Is what?
It's a privilege.
It's a privilege, and it's also accessible. In other words, it's something which is for you, not for you to sacrifice yourself for, right? Whether you look at the positives or the restrictions. We talked about that. So how did it become a different religion, Son of God, Christianity? In its inception, so Jesus did deviate from the rabbinic establishment. While he overall was a rabbinic Jew, kept Jewish law, there were some things which rubbed him the wrong way. The commercialization of the temple, when he complained about the money changers in the temple, right? The fact that the rabbis said that you don't use medicine on Shabbat. Sabbath is a day of healing, so why shouldn't we be able to heal? And he complained that the people at the time focused more on the form of the laws than the spirit of the law, which is a valid complaint. The prophets for 500 years before that had been complaining about that as well. Okay, so he did go against the rabbinic establishment, which the rabbis did not appreciate. And but what really caused him the problems was that he put himself in the image of the prophets and of a Messiah. So Elijah, 500 years before him, healed the lepers. Jesus healed the lepers. But he did more than that. He rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, which in the book of Joel, one of the prophets, said the Messiah will ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He gathered to teach on the Mount of Olives, which the prophet Zechariah said, the final redemption will come from the Mount of Olives. So it did look like he was self-consciously positioning himself as a messianic figure. And by the way, he wasn't the only one. There were several other before him, and what would the Romans do? They would take them, and they would execute them in the way of political prisoners, which was what? Crucify them. If someone was a criminal and stole, they'd take them and they'd knock them out and kill them. But when they wanted to make an example of someone, they would take them and nail them onto a piece of wood to show other people, hey, don't start doing this. Now, it is very possible, as the New Testament says, that the rabbis reported on Jesus to the Romans. Okay? Because they also didn't want him around. He was going against the establishment. But it's very clear that the Romans are the ones who actually killed him. And the Romans had motivation to kill him because, as I said before, if you walk around saying you're going to be the king of the Jews and you're running a kingdom, you know, the Romans running or in the kingdom business, they're not going to be too happy with you. So that's in terms of the deicide charge that the Jews killed Jesus. We didn't kill him. Did we have a hand in his execution by the Romans? It's possible, yes, but he was considered to be a rebel. Big questions. And by the way, figure. Messiah has to come from the house of David. Where does David come from? Where was David born? Bethlehem. King David was from Bethlehem. Who was also from Bethlehem? Jesus, right? But was he?
I have no idea.
He was from Nazareth. Where's Nazareth? In northern Israel. So his family was from Nazareth. So why were they in Bethlehem? So the Testament does have a reason. They say, well, they're originally from Bethlehem. They moved up to Nazareth, and the Romans did a census and said you've got to move back to where you're originally from. Was he? Was he not? It's possible, or it's possible that they're trying to link him to these messianic themes, right? So, but really, possibly were a Jewish messianic movement. Now, not messianic in the way Jewish messianists are known today, but a group of Jews who believed the Messiah had come. Sound familiar?
Like the Rebbe?
Like today, Chabad, right. They say the Rebbe was the Messiah. He died. Well, he didn't finish the job. But he was contender for Messiah, and he might come and finish the job. Okay? So that is not outside the pale of Judaism, totally. It's kind of not frequent. It's kind of like borderline, but it's not outside the pale. And the real issue became the emphasis on Jesus as the Son of God. And once again, when this came about, did it start already when he was living? When he died? It's not clear. And this is really the crux of the issue, because once you say someone's the Son of God, then that's no longer Judaism. That's no longer monotheism, and you've really created a different religion. Now, it's also interesting that there were mystery cults of fertility in Egypt. Isis, everyone's heard of Isis? Not the Isis. The deity Isis, or Attis. Attis in Asia, where the theory was that a human sacrifice was offered to replenish the vigor of nature. They're resurrected and they come back as a god. Sound familiar? Right? So, in all ancient religions. And it's a theme that we'll now see emerging. Early Christianity. Now, at one point in the New Testament, Jesus does refer to himself as Son of God. But you know where else that expression is found? In the Psalms of King David. King David tells us, you are sons of God. Literal? Obviously not. So what did Jesus mean by it? If he didn't know what he meant by it. Did he mean it like King David did? Did he mean it literally? But it really doesn't matter, because his disciples took it, applied it literally, and that's when early Christianity became a messianic Jewish movement. They were still eating kosher, still keeping the Shabbat, still reading the Torah, still doing all the things, except they believed that he was the Son of God who died for humanity's sins and came to redeem them, and through his death, man is redeemed. And this is where they diverge. And then,
Even though a lot of other people also died in the same exact manner, she just told us. That a lot of people
yes.
died the same manner.
Yeah.
That idea that was
report him being resurrected and returning to his disciples. There are all these supernatural things
Right.
happening, which some of the rabbis, it says, their ghosts or their souls returned and appeared. But in Jewish teaching, there's never a case where someone was physically resurrected and returned.
I think the answer is that it wasn't about crucifixion per se, but about him. You know, if he had been killed some other way, that probably would have been part of the.
But crucifixion was a common way of the Romans killing political people. They,
I know that's interesting.
made political trouble.
It's
So
particularly
really the emphasis
in-
was,
Yeah.
and once again, some historians suggest maybe it's a merging of these ancient Near Eastern cults of the person dying and then becoming a god, atoning or bringing something to humanity by doing that, and merging that with, there are a lot of possibilities. But, even the Son of God, the Immaculate Conception, that God impregnated her, didn't appear till 400 years later in Christianity. And it's actually based upon a mistranslation, because Isaiah 49, where it says a child will be born, and his name will be Emmanuel, and he will be the one to redeem, we believe that prophecy of Isaiah was being prophesied about King Hezekiah, who brought about a religious renewal amongst Jewish people. We talked about it earlier. They say it was talking about Jesus, who lived 500 years later. And it says that a child will be born to an Alma. Now, what is an Alma? So the Hebrew translation of Alma is a young girl. They translate it as a virgin. The Hebrew word for virgin is Betula, not Alma. So it was afterwards retroactively justified based upon a false translation.
Who was translated?
With a book called the Septuagint, which was the early Christian translation of the Torah into Greek, which then included the New Testament as well. So the Christians were not using the few months later, they were Hebrew. And let's remember, what was the most common language, the two languages which were spoken at the time? 3 languages.
Greek, Roman,
Greek, Latin, and
right.
English. Of course, English
Latin,
Right.
and Latin and Aramaic.
There was no English.
In fact, when
But Aramaic and Hebrew are really similar, right?
they're pretty similar, but not the same.
Same letters.
Not the same letters, but a lot of different words. Okay, so the Jews might have known Aramaic, might have known Hebrew, but the Immaculate Conception mistranslation didn't happen until a few hundred years later anyway. And a shift had already happened. What happened was the early Christian communities were living next to Jewish communities. They were practicing Judaism, but they believed Jesus was the Messiah and possibly the Son of God. And what happened was some of them would start slipping back into Jewish community, back and forth. Okay? So the rabbis were also trying to draw them back. So they had a disciple, Shaul, who they sent to go to all these Jewish communities and to try and tell the Jews, just join us, come back into the fold. He was along the road to Antioch. He has a vision. Jesus comes to him, so he says, and tells him, the program, and his Greek name was not Shaul, it was Shaul and Paul. And he does a 180-degree turn. Instead of trying to get Jews back into Judaism, he tries to get non-Jews into Christianity. And this is where they start shifting Christianity. They change the Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday to make sure that the Christians don't fall back into Judaism. And they also, Saul is brilliant. He comes up with this great marketing strategy. See, there were a lot of non-Jews who were drawn to Judaism. Because ethical monotheism says even the poorest of person is created in the image of God. Everyone has human dignity. Everyone has rights. A lot better than the Roman, you know. If you own land and you got power, you got rights. Otherwise, none. So they were very drawn to it, but just one slight problem. You can't eat whatever you want. You can't work for a day, and if you're a guy, you got to do chop chop, right? Yeah. Circumcision. So not something that everyone wants to go through. So Paul had a great marketing strategy. We'll give them ethical monotheism without the tough stuff. No more kosher. No more not working on Sabbath. No more circumcision. They'll circumcise their hearts instead through feeling. And he mass marketed it, and it took off like wildfire. In the beginning, it was very bad because the Romans looked at it more threatening than Judaism. It was not an official religion, and that's when, you know, the Christians being thrown into the gladiators in the arena. See the movie Ben-Hur, which they're remaking, which is a terrible Jewish PR thing, because Ben-Hur was a Jew who becomes, in the end, he sees the light, you know. It's really a proselytizing movie. So, this Jew who becomes a Christian. But, so that's how Christianity took off. It took off like wildfire, spread out throughout until 400 years later, one of the Roman empires will have his own revelation, his own epiphany, see Jesus in the sky. Justinian has a revelation of Jesus. Finish it, and the Roman Empire becomes the whole empire. Okay. In the middle of all of this, and we didn't have time to get to it, the Roman oppression gets worse and worse. The Jews are sick of it, and they rebel against the Romans. And turn against the Romans and try to rebel in the year 70. The Romans quash the rebellion. The people of Masada kill themselves, and the Romans destroy the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews are still living there, though. Things are still bad. In the year 116, 112, 116, they try to rebel again. It's crushed. And there's a series, one of those Hadrianic persecutions. Jews aren't allowed to study Torah. Famous story of Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis who were martyred. We read in the Yom Kippur prayer book about the rabbis who were killed for teaching Torah. And then finally, in the year 132, they try to rebel again. And Bar Kokhba leads a rebellion. Other non-Jewish provinces in the area rebel. They have an army of 300,000. And some people believe they retook Jerusalem and for 2 years started offering sacrifices in Jerusalem again. And then the rebellion is eventually quashed. By then the Romans are sick of the Jews. They kick all the Jews out of Israel, back to Alexandria, around, destroy Jerusalem, level and build it as their capital. And they name after the biblical enemy of the Jews who were known as the Philistines. And they renamed the country Palestine. Okay? In the year 133. The only thing left in Israel of the Jewish people is when one of the rabbis tried to broker a peace with Vespasian, the Roman emperor who destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70. Titus actually destroyed it. He asked that the rabbis be allowed to continue studying and teaching. And so they moved the Rabbinic Academy out of Jerusalem to another city called Yavne, and then Sipori, and then Tiberias. But the Rabbinic Academy remained, and this is what eventually wrote down the Mishnah, the core of the Talmud, because the rabbis knew that the Jewish people were dispersed all over. And so they knew there had to be a central book which would set down Jewish life. And so they wrote down the Mishnah, which was the oral Torah, which was not supposed to be written down, but they wrote it down so they would preserve Jewish next to Jewish exile, which was last
until June 1947.
48, right? From the year 70 of the Common Era, some 18 and 48 to 1878. 1,878 years. If you consider the establishment of the State of Israel as the end of the exile. Jews were returning before that, whatever, however you do it. But so some 1,800 years. And not next week, because next week we're going to talk about Passover, right? Why did the cat eat the goat? Understanding the Passover Seder from the song Chagaya. And we'll give you 3 little nuggets to take with you. And then there's Passover, where we've done a class. And the week after Passover, we'll come back to talking about the next 1,000 years of Jewish history. Right, from the beginning of the turn of the millennium, actually we'll talk about the next 1,500 years of Jewish history through the Middle Ages. Then the week after that is before Yom HaShoah. We'll talk about the modernity and culmination of modernity and the Holocaust. The week after that, which is the week before Israel Independence Day, we'll talk about the modern Zionism and the independence of Israel. So that's what's coming up. So you got to wait a few weeks, but we'll get there eventually.